At the hearing, my new wife wept before the judge. "Your Honor, my husband is no longer mentally competent. My son and I will manage his estate and care for him for the rest of his life." My attorney grabbed my arm. "Fight this." I shook my head. "Let her have it." At the final hearing, she smiled like she had already won. Then the judge closed the file, looked at her attorney, said one sentence. Their faces went white. They realized it far too late they had walked straight into his trap. I'm so grateful you're here on Dad's Revenge Stories. Comment below with your city or country, so I know where you're watching from. Also, please note this story blends creative elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to specific names or settings is coincidental, but the core message remains highly valuable for you. Courtroom 3 at the Fairfax County Courthouse had not changed in the 20 years I had been coming here to notarize building permits, file zoning appeals, and argue over setback requirements with county officials who never quite understood what I was trying to build. The same dark wood paneling, the same fluorescent lights that hummed just slightly off-key, the same smell of old paper and recycled air that made you feel like time had stopped somewhere around 1984 and simply refused to move forward. I sat at the respondent's table with my hands folded in my lap and my eyes pointed at a fixed spot on the floor, roughly 2 feet in front of my shoes. My suit was the charcoal gray one Eleanor had picked out for me last Christmas. I had not chosen it this morning. She had laid it across the foot of the bed while I was in the shower, and I had put it on without a word, the way a man does when he has already decided to let someone believe they are in control. Eleanor was at the petitioner's table 12 feet away. She wore a cream-colored blouse and a single strand of pearls. Her attorney, Charles Benton, had arranged 4 accordion folders across the table with the precision of a man who charged $400 an hour and wanted everyone in the room to know it. My attorney, Michael Ross, leaned close to my ear. His breath smelled like the black coffee he had been drinking since 6 that morning. "Arthur," he said, his voice low and tight as a cable under load, "you need to fight this. If you let her walk out of here with guardianship, Miller Architecture is gone. Everything you spent 40 years building, gone." I did not look at him. I looked at my hands instead. These hands had drafted the Meridian Tower on Route 7. They had sketched the children's wing of Inova Fairfax Hospital on a paper napkin during a lunch meeting in 2003. They had held my daughter Claire when she was 4 hours old, and they had held her again at the end in a hospital room that smelled nothing like the one she had been born in. I turned my palms over slowly the way you examine a structural drawing before you sign off on it. Then I shook my head. "Let her have it," I said. Michael pulled back. I heard the sharp intake of breath through his nose. "Arthur, I have to advise you in the strongest possible terms." "I know what you're advising, Michael." My voice came out slower than usual, slightly thickened the way a man's voice sounds when his mind is not fully present. That was intentional. "I just want it to be over. I'm tired." From the corner of my eye, I saw Eleanor's shoulders drop by exactly a 1/4 inch. Relief carefully contained. David, her son, sat one chair behind her in the gallery. His right knee had been bouncing since we entered the room, but it stopped the moment I said those words. He pressed his palm flat against his thigh and the knee went still. 23 years in architecture teaches you to read a structure before it speaks. You learn where the stress concentrates, where the joints are weak, where a building will fail before the failure becomes visible. People are not so different. I had been watching David and Eleanor for 3 months, reading every gesture, every hesitation, every small betrayal of confidence. They thought I was losing my mind. They had no idea I had been studying them more carefully than any blueprint I had ever drawn. Judge Helen Whitaker entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She was a small woman with silver hair and the kind of steady gaze that comes from 2 decades of watching people lie to her face. Everyone rose. I rose slowly, one hand on the table edge, making the effort visible. Eleanor's attorney glanced at me with the mild pity of a man who thought he had already won. Benton opened for the petitioners with a confidence that filled the room like fresh concrete, heavy, smooth, and fast-setting. He spoke about cognitive decline, about the sacred duty of family, about the tragedy of a great man reduced by illness. He used the word dementia 11 times. I counted. He placed Arthur Miller, architect and founder of Miller Architecture, gently but firmly into the category of men who could no longer be trusted to manage their own affairs. Eleanor took the stand. She pressed a folded tissue against the corner of her eye before a single tear had actually formed, and when she spoke, her voice carried the precise calibration of a woman who had rehearsed this performance in the bathroom mirror every morning for 6 weeks. "Your Honor," she said softly, "my husband is not the man he was. I watch him every day. I see him struggle. I see him frightened and confused in his own home." Her voice broke on the word home. It was a very good break. "I am only asking this court to allow me and my son David to protect him, to care for him, the way he would have cared for us." The courtroom was quiet. Several people in the gallery nodded slowly. Michael's pen tapped twice against his legal pad. A signal. I gave him nothing back. No nod, no eye contact, no shift in posture. I kept my gaze at that fixed point 2 feet in front of my shoes and let my jaw go slightly slack the way it does on a man whose attention keeps sliding off the present moment like water off a pitched roof. Benton rested his case with the satisfied energy of a man collecting on a sure bet. He buttoned his jacket and sat down. Then something happened that no one else in that courtroom noticed. In the space between one breath and the next, I allowed myself one thing I had not permitted in 3 months of playing this role. A smile. Small, private, gone before it fully formed. It moved through the left corner of my mouth and disappeared. They had signed documents this morning that they believed would give them everything. They had dressed carefully prepared speeches, arranged folders. They had spent 3 months believing they were dismantling the life of a confused old man who had lost his grip on reality. They had no idea what I had already built. To understand what happened in courtroom 3, you have to go back 3 months. Back to a Tuesday evening in June when the rain came down so hard against the windows of my study that I could not hear the television in the next room, and the only light in the house came from the drafting lamp on my work table and the soft blue glow of a nightlight in the hallway upstairs. I am Arthur Miller, 70 years old, founder of Miller Architecture, a firm I built from a single rented room in Alexandria, with 2 drafting tables, 1 telephone, and a conviction that good design could make ordinary people feel less ordinary. Over 43 years, we grew into one of the most recognized architectural practices in Northern Virginia. Office buildings, hospital wings, public libraries, a pedestrian bridge over the Potomac that the Washington Post called quietly magnificent in the spring of 2009. I kept that clipping in my desk drawer, not out of vanity, out of gratitude. My wife, Margaret, died 4 years before the events I am about to describe. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and the speed of it left me with a grief that had no proper shape the way a building looks when you remove a load-bearing wall without replacing it with something else. Everything leans. Nothing falls outright, but nothing sits straight either. I remarried 18 months later. Eleanor Voss was 52 years old when we met at a charity dinner for the Virginia Historical Society. She was composed and elegant, and she laughed at the right moments, and she seemed in those early months to be exactly what a man my age tells himself he needs: companionship, warmth, someone to hand the coffee to in the morning without having to explain where the mugs were kept. She brought her son David with her into the marriage. He was 31 between jobs in the way that some men are perpetually between jobs, and he moved into the east wing of the house on Willow Creek Drive, with the quiet entitlement of someone who believed proximity to money was the same as earning it. But none of that was what kept me at my drafting table on rainy evenings in June. What kept me there was Leo. Leo was 7 years old, and he slept in the room at the top of the stairs, with a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, and a stuffed dog named Captain that had lost one eye sometime during the previous winter and had not seemed to mind. He was my daughter Claire's son. Claire had been 34 years old when a driver ran a red light on Interstate 66 on a wet November morning and took everything she had left to give to the world. Leo had been 3. He remembered almost nothing of her now, and that fact sat in my chest like a structural defect I had no method to repair. On that Tuesday evening in June, I heard his feet on the stairs at 8:30. Small feet in socked feet, the particular sound of a child who is not trying to sneak, but is also not trying to announce himself. He appeared in the doorway of my study in his pajamas, the ones with the small rocket ships on them, holding Captain by one ear. "Grandpa," he said, "you forgot to come say good night." I set down my pencil. The drawing on the table in front of me was a preliminary sketch for a community center in Herndon, all clean lines and natural light, the kind of building that makes people slow down when they walk past it. I turned my chair around to face him. "I did forget," I said. "Come here." He crossed the room and climbed into my lap with the complete physical confidence of a child who has never once been made to feel unwelcome in that particular space. He smelled like soap and something slightly like the strawberry shampoo Eleanor had bought him, and he leaned his head back against my chest and looked up at the architectural drawings pinned to the walls around us. "Which one is your favorite?" he asked. He asked me this nearly every time he came into the study. The answer changed depending on the evening. Tonight, I looked around at the drawings. The bridge. The one over the water. The one over the water. He considered this seriously, the way 7-year-olds consider things they have decided matter. "I like the hospital one," he said, "because it helps sick people." I tightened my arms around him slightly. Just slightly. "That's a better reason than mine," I said. He fell asleep in my lap 11 minutes later. I carried him upstairs and tucked the blanket around his shoulders and stood at the door of his room for a moment longer than necessary, watching the rise and fall of his breathing in the blue light of the crescent moon. This was what I was protecting. Not the firm, not the buildings, not the accounts or the contracts or the 43 years of work that had produced them. This boy asleep in this room in a house I had designed with the specific intention that it would outlast me and hold the people I loved safely inside it. I was back at my drafting table by 9:30. The rain had not let up. I was reaching for my pencil when I heard them below me in the kitchen. Eleanor's voice low and deliberate. David's voice lower still. I could not make out the words, only the rhythm of them. The back and forth of two people who had said whatever they were saying before, who had an agreement, who were not discussing but confirming. I told myself it was nothing. Household logistics, weekend plans, the particular murmur of a step-family finding its private language. I picked up my pencil. I drew one clean line across the page. Then I set the pencil down again and sat very still in my chair, listening to the sound of rain against glass and the voices beneath me that I could not quite hear. Something in the foundation, I thought. Something not quite right. I did not know yet what it was, but 43 years of reading structures had given me a sense for the moment, before a thing reveals itself. The slight vibration in the floor before the crack appears in the wall. the way a room goes quiet right before it tells you what it has been hiding. I turned off the drafting lamp. In the darkness, the rain sounded louder. The first Tuesday after that rainy evening, I walked into my study at 7 in the morning, the way I had done every working day for 30 years, set my coffee on the right side of the drafting table, and reached for the Herndon Community Center file. It was not there. I checked the second shelf, the flat drawer beneath the table surface, the credenza along the wall where I kept overflow files when a project grew too large for the table. Nothing. I stood in the middle of the room with my coffee going cold in my hand, and a feeling spreading through my chest that I did not have an immediate name for. Not panic. Something quieter and more unsettling than panic. The feeling of a man who has just noticed that a wall he has been walking past every day is no longer perfectly vertical. I found the file 40 minutes later. It was in the kitchen on the counter beside the toaster, underneath a Williams-Sonoma catalog that had arrived in the mail. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs. That was the first one. Over the following 2 weeks, there were others. I forgot a conference call with the Herndon Planning Board and remembered it only when my project manager sent a second reminder. I called Leo by the wrong name. Twice I called him Daniel, which had been the name of a college roommate I had not thought about in 30 years. One afternoon, I stood in the doorway of the downstairs bathroom for what felt like a very long time, genuinely unsure which direction I had been heading when I stopped. Eleanor noticed everything. That was the thing about Eleanor. She had the observational patience of a woman who had decided some time ago that information was the most valuable currency available to her, and she collected it the way other women collected jewelry. Every stumble, every hesitation, every moment of confusion, she filed it away behind those composed gray eyes without a word. "Arthur," she said one morning at breakfast, sliding a white ceramic mug across the kitchen island toward me. "I've been reading about something called mild cognitive impairment. It can happen to very accomplished people. The brain just gets tired." She said it the way you say something you have been thinking about for weeks, but are only now bringing up out of concern rather than calculation. I made an appointment with Dr. Hargrove for next Thursday. Just a screening. Nothing alarming. "I don't need a screening," I said. "Of course not." She smiled and refilled her own coffee. "But humor me." David appeared in the kitchen doorway 3 minutes later, in running clothes he had not run in. He poured himself a glass of orange juice and leaned against the counter, with the loose, unhurried posture of a man who had nowhere to be and had made peace with that fact. "Morning, Arthur," he said. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine," I said. He nodded slowly, studying me over the rim of his glass, with an attention he was not quite skilled enough to disguise as casual. "You were up pretty late. I heard you moving around." "I was working." "Right." Another slow nod. "Of course." The tea appeared 3 days after that conversation. Eleanor set a canister of it on the kitchen counter beside the electric kettle. Dark green tin gold lettering, the kind of packaging designed to suggest that whatever was inside had been sourced from somewhere ancient and expensive. She said a colleague at her garden club had recommended it. Ginkgo biloba lion's mane mushroom, something called Bacopa monieri. All clinically studied, she said. All shown to support cognitive function in older adults. She said older adults. With great gentleness, the way you use a word you know lands like a stone, but are pretending is a feather. I drank the first cup that evening after dinner, because refusing it would have required an explanation I was not ready to give. It tasted like wet bark with a faint sweetness underneath, and Leo, who was sitting across from me doing homework at the kitchen table, wrinkled his nose when he smelled it. "That's gross, Grandpa," he said. "It is," I agreed. The following morning I felt slightly off, a heaviness behind my eyes. a half-second delay between thinking a word and finding it. I told myself it was poor sleep. I had been sleeping poorly for weeks. Thomas Garner stopped by the office on a Wednesday afternoon that same week. Thomas had been my site superintendent for 30 years. He was 63, broad-shouldered, with hands that had poured concrete and read blueprints in equal measure, and a directness that I had always valued more than I could properly express. He sat across my desk, looked at me for a long moment after we had finished discussing a project in Reston, and then said what he was actually thinking. "You look tired, Arthur, and I don't mean the regular kind." "I'm fine, Thomas. I've known you since George H.W. Bush was in office." He leaned forward and rested both forearms on the edge of my desk. "I know what fine looks like on you. This isn't it." I wanted to tell him everything right then. The files out of place, the wrong name, the bathroom doorway, the tea that tasted like something that had not been designed for drinking. I wanted to lay it all out in front of him, the way I would lay out a structural problem. Here are the symptoms. Here is what they suggest. Here is what I think is causing them. Instead, I said, "I haven't been sleeping well, that's all." Thomas held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he stood, picked up his hard hat from the corner of my desk, and said, "All right, but you call me. Whatever time it is, whatever day, you call me first." He left before I could answer. I sat at my desk after he was gone and looked at the drawings on the wall and thought about what it meant that the person who knew me best in the world had walked into my office and seen something I had not yet let myself fully see. That evening, Eleanor set a fresh cup of tea on my nightstand before bed. She patted my hand. She told me to sleep well. She turned off the light on her way out. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me. Somewhere above me, Leo slept under his crescent moon nightlight, with Captain the one-eyed dog tucked under his arm. I reached over and picked up my phone from the nightstand. My thumb moved to the camera application out of pure habit. I had checked the feeds every night for years before going to sleep, a system I had expanded room by room over the past decade until it covered the study, the hallway, the workshop, and the kitchen. The models and drawings were the original reason. The habit had outlasted the reason. The app opened, and the kitchen feed filled the screen. Before I disclose the horrific reality recorded by the security camera that night, please comment "following" to show you're still here with us. And please note the next part of the story features fictional plot lines to increase the suspense. If this content does not serve you, you may exit the video at this point. The kitchen feed was sharp and still. The timestamp in the upper right corner read 2:14 in the morning. The overhead light above the island was on casting that particular yellow that kitchens have at night, when everyone is supposed to be asleep, and nobody is. Eleanor stood at the counter with her back partially to the camera. David stood beside her, closer than people stand when they are having a casual conversation. He was holding something I could not immediately identify, a small glass vial, dark, no label. As I watched, he set it on the counter, unscrewed the cap, and tapped a fine, pale powder into his palm. Then he picked up the green tin canister. The tea. My tea. He tipped the powder in and replaced the lid with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had done this before. My thumb tightened on the phone. My chest did not move. I was holding my breath without having decided to. David's voice came through the phone speaker, low but clear enough. The camera system I had installed included directional audio pickup, a feature I had added 3 years ago after a contractor walked off with $30,000 worth of architectural models. 3 more months at this dosage, he said. His brain will be completely gone. The court will hand us Miller architecture without a fight. We put him in a memory care facility in Fredericksburg. The boy goes to a boarding school in West Virginia. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not reach for his arm or lower her voice or show any of the physical signs of a person hearing something that troubled them. She picked up the canister, examined the lid to confirm it was properly sealed, and set it back in its place beside the kettle. "Make sure the dosage stays consistent," she said. "Hargrove's report needs to show a clear progression." David nodded. "It will." I set the phone face down on the mattress. The ceiling above me was the same ceiling I had looked at for 11 years, white, with a hairline crack running from the light fixture toward the east wall that I had been meaning to have someone look at. I had designed this house. I had drawn every room calculated, every load specified, every material. I had built it to last and to hold and to protect, and I had let 2 people walk into it. My throat tightened until swallowing hurt. Not from fear. From something older and more corrosive than fear, the particular grief of a man who has trusted badly and cannot unknow it. I thought about Margaret. I thought about Claire. I thought about every person I had ever built something, for every structure I had ever raised, on the belief that a well-designed thing could keep the people inside it safe. Then I thought about something else. Something a 7-year-old boy had said to me 11 days ago, standing in the doorway of my study in rocket ship pajamas, holding a stuffed dog by one ear. I had not understood it at the time. I had filed it in the part of my mind where you put the things children say that seem important but lack context, a drawer you intend to return to and rarely do. But lying there in the dark with my thumb pressed against the back of my phone, the memory came back to me with a clarity that made my eyes sting. Leo had come into the study on a Sunday afternoon while I was reviewing shop drawings. He had stood beside my chair for a moment, without speaking, which was unusual for him. Leo was not a quiet child by nature. When he was quiet, it meant he was thinking about whether to say something, which meant the something mattered. "Grandpa," he had said finally, "I saw Mommy Eleanor and David last night, in the kitchen, really late." I had looked up from the drawings. "What were you doing up that late?" "I had a bad dream. I was going to get water." He twisted Captain's remaining ear between his fingers. "They were putting something into your tea jar. I didn't know what it was. It was like a powder, from a little bottle." He looked up at me with the direct, unfiltered gaze that children have before the world teaches them to look away. "Is that normal? Do people put powder in tea?" I had told him yes. I had told him it was probably a vitamin supplement, something to help the tea work better. I had kissed the top of his head and sent him back to bed and returned to my shop drawings and told myself I was being sensible. I had not been sensible. I had been afraid of what believing him would require me to do. I picked the phone back up. I replayed the kitchen footage from the beginning. I watched it twice more each time, noting details I had not registered on the first. Viewing the specific way David tilted the vial, the angle of Eleanor's shoulders, the practiced efficiency of 2 people executing a plan they had already agreed on in a different room on a different night before I had any idea there was a plan to agree on. Leo had told me. He had stood in my study in his pajamas and told me plainly, and I had explained it away because I was not ready to accept what it meant. I sat up on the edge of the bed. The floor was cold through my socks. Outside, the neighborhood was completely dark except for the street light on the corner of Willow Creek and Ashford that had been flickering for 3 weeks and that the county had not yet come to fix. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that specifically because they should have been. Instead, they were very still, resting on my knees, the same hands that had steadied a drawing pencil for 43 years when everything around the project was uncertain and the only reliable thing was the line you were about to draw. An architect does not tear down a rotten structure in the middle of the night. He does not act on anger or grief or the first wave of understanding that hits him before he has fully taken the measure of what he is dealing with. He sits with the problem. He identifies every point of failure. He draws the plan. I stood up. I walked quietly to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists until my pulse settled. Then I walked back to the bed, picked up the green tin canister from the nightstand, and carried it to the closet. On the top shelf behind a box of Margaret's books, I had never been able to give away, I kept an identical canister of plain chamomile tea that I had bought for insomnia 2 winters ago and never finished. I made the swap in under 60 seconds. Tomorrow morning, Eleanor would watch me drink my tea. She would watch me set the cup down and stare at nothing for a moment too long. She would see exactly what she expected to see, and I would begin to build the last structure of my life. By 4:30 in the morning, I had not slept. I had sat in the wing-back chair in the corner of the bedroom with the lamp off and my hands folded in my lap, and worked through the problem, the way I work through every structural problem methodically, without sentiment, starting from what I knew for certain and building outward from there. What I knew, Eleanor and David had been introducing a substance into my tea for an undetermined number of weeks. The substance produced symptoms consistent with cognitive decline. They intended to use those symptoms as the basis for a legal petition to assume control of Miller Architecture and remove both me and Leo from the house on Willow Creek Drive. They believed the process was already well underway and that I was unaware of it. What I had: footage, a timestamp, audio, a 7-year-old witness who had already told me what he saw and whom I had failed to believe quickly enough. What I needed: time. Enough of it to build something they could not dismantle after the fact. At 5:45, I got up dressed in the dark and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty and smelled like the automatic coffee maker had just finished its cycle. I poured a cup and stood at the window over the sink and watched the backyard come gray and then green as the sun came up behind the tree line. The green tin canister sat beside the kettle exactly where Eleanor had placed it the night before. I had already made the swap. The powder that had been inside it was now sealed in a small Ziploc bag tucked inside an old drafting tool case on the top shelf of my closet behind Margaret's books. I would get it to someone who could identify it. Later. One thing at a time. I heard Leo on the stairs at 6:50. He appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his school clothes, but with his shirt untucked and one shoe already on the other in his hand, which was his standard morning configuration. "Your shirt," I said. He looked down, tucked it in with the economical efficiency of a child who had received this note before, and sat down at the island. I put a bowl of cereal in front of him and sat across from him with my coffee. He studied me for a moment with those direct brown eyes. "Grandpa, you look different." "Different how?" He considered this carefully. "Like when you're thinking about a building, but not a happy building, a broken one." I looked at him over the rim of my mug. 7 years old, and he read me better than most adults I had known for decades. I thought about what to say. I thought about the Ziploc bag in the closet, and the footage on my phone, and the 11 days I had lost because I had not believed him when he told me. "Leo," I said, "do you remember what you told me a week and a half ago about what you saw in the kitchen?" He stopped chewing. His eyes went careful the way a child's eyes go when they realize a grown-up is taking something seriously that they weren't sure would be taken seriously. "The powder," he said. "That's right. Was it bad?" I set my mug down. "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking me too many questions yet. Can you do that?" He straightened his spine the way he did when he was deciding to be brave. "Yes. I need you to act normal. Around Eleanor, around David. Can you do that?" He thought about this for 3 full seconds. "Like how you act normal even when you're worried?" The accuracy of that landed somewhere between my ribs. Exactly like that, I said. He picked up his spoon and went back to his cereal. Okay, he said. Matter of fact, no drama. 7 years old and steadier than most of the adults I was going to need in the coming weeks. Eleanor came downstairs at 7:15. She was dressed and composed in the way she was always dressed and composed by 7:15, and she moved through the kitchen with the fluid efficiency of a woman who had organized her mornings down to the minute. She noticed Leo's empty bowl, the coffee I had made the canister, in its place beside the kettle. She picked up the canister, removed the lid, looked inside briefly, the way you check that a thing is still where you left it, replaced the lid, set it back down. I watched her do this from the corner of my eye while appearing to look at the table. "Did you sleep, Arthur?" she asked. "On and off," I said. I let my voice come out slightly slower than usual, slightly thicker. I picked up my coffee mug and then set it down in the wrong place 2 inches to the left of the coaster and did not correct it. Eleanor watched the mug miss the coaster. Something moved through her expression, not concern, not quite satisfaction, something between them that had no clean name. "I'll make you some tea before you head to the office," she said. "That would be nice," I said. David appeared at 7:30 and stood in the kitchen eating toast and watching me the way you watch something you have invested in and want to see performing correctly. I asked him twice what day it was. The second time I already knew the answer, but I let the question sit in the air a moment too long before asking it, and I watched David's jaw relax by a fraction when I did. They were satisfied. That was the most dangerous thing about the position I was in. They were satisfied, which meant they were not looking carefully. Satisfied people make assumptions. They stop checking. They move on to the next phase of the plan because they believe the current phase is complete. I let David answer my question about the day. I thanked him. I picked up my briefcase and walked to the garage with the slightly uncertain gait I had been practicing in my head since 4:30 that morning. In the car with the garage door closed and the engine not yet started, when I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out a business card. The edges were soft from years in the same pocket. Michael J. Ross, attorney at law. 22 years. The man had drawn up my first partnership agreement and my last will and testament, and every significant document in between. I turned the card over in my fingers. On the back, in my own handwriting from some long-ago meeting, I had written his cell number. I needed to be careful about how I made this call. Eleanor checked the house phone records. Occasionally, I had noticed the browser history on the shared computer 3 months ago and noted it without reacting. My personal cell was safer, but not safe enough if she had access to the carrier account, which as my spouse she legally did. I thought about this for a moment. Then I backed out of the garage, drove 2 blocks to the Sunoco station on Ashford Road, and used the payphone beside the air pump that I had not seen anyone use in approximately 9 years. Michael picked up on the 3rd ring. "Ross." "It's Arthur," I said. "Don't say my name out loud if anyone can hear you." A pause. The sound of a door closing. "Arthur, what's wrong?" "I need to see you," I said. "Tomorrow morning, early, before anyone else arrives at your office." Another pause. When Michael spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I recognized the shift from social to professional, from friend to attorney, the gear change I had heard him make 100 times over 2 decades. 6:30, he said. "Side entrance on King Street. I'll leave it unlocked." "Thank you," I said. "Arthur." His voice tightened. "Are you safe right now?" I looked out through the smudged payphone glass at Ashford Road in the early morning. The familiar streetlights, the coffee shop across the street that had been a dry cleaner when I first moved to Fairfax, The ordinary geography of a life that was no longer quite what it appeared to be. Not entirely, I said, but I will be. The side entrance to Michael's office on King Street was a plain gray door between a sandwich shop and a title company. The kind of door you walk past 100 times without registering. It exists. I had parked 2 blocks away and walked collar up against the early morning chill, arriving at 6:28. The door was unlocked as promised. I let myself in and climbed the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. Michael was already at his desk. He had been an attorney for 22 years, and he looked it not old exactly, but seasoned, the way good structural steel looks seasoned, carrying the evidence of every load it had ever held. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and a pen in his hand, and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, which told me he had been there since at least 5:30 and had been too preoccupied to drink it. He stood when I came in. "Arthur." He crossed the room and gripped my hand with both of his. "Sit down. Tell me everything." I sat. I told him everything. The camera footage. The powder. David's voice through the speaker at 2:14 in the morning. Leo standing in my study 11 days before that in his rocket ship pajamas. The canister swap. Eleanor checking the lid that morning in the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a woman confirming an investment was performing on schedule. Michael did not interrupt. He wrote on his legal pad in the tight, economical shorthand he had developed over 2 decades of taking notes, while people told him the worst things that had ever happened to them. When I finished, he set the pen down and looked at me for a long moment across the desk. Then he said, "There's something I need to tell you." His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. Not the professional steadiness he used in courtrooms, or the warm directness he used as a friend, but something underneath both of those rougher and less certain, the voice of a man who has been carrying a weight and is not sure the floor will hold when he sets it down. 6 weeks ago, he said, Eleanor contacted me. The room was very quiet. On King Street below us, a delivery truck was backing up, beeping steadily, the sound coming through the old windows in a muffled rhythm. She called the office line, Michael continued. Said she was concerned about your cognitive health and wanted to discuss your legal affairs in the context of a potential guardianship. I told her that was a conflict of interest and ended the call. He paused. 3 days later, a courier delivered an envelope to my home address. Not the office, my home. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and withdrew a standard white business envelope. He set it on the desk between us but did not push it toward me. Inside was a cashier's check for $150,000 and a handwritten note. I looked at the envelope. I did not pick it up. What did the note say? I asked. Michael's jaw tightened. It said that if I provided only minimal representation in any upcoming legal proceedings involving your estate, the check was mine to keep. If I chose to represent you aggressively, she would file a complaint with the Virginia State Bar, alleging that I had improperly influenced a client with diminished capacity. He exhaled through his nose. She was going to use your supposed illness as leverage against me, whether I took the money or not. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the delivery truck had stopped beeping. The morning was very quiet. You didn't tell me, I said. I didn't tell you. He met my eyes without flinching, which I respected. A lesser man would have looked at the desk. I told myself I was protecting you from additional stress, that it wasn't relevant because I had already refused, that the right thing was to handle it quietly and move forward. He shook his head slowly. The truth is, I was afraid of what it meant. If she was willing to go that far before any legal proceeding had even started, I didn't know how far she would go once one did. I made a decision I should have let you make. I looked at the envelope on the desk. $150,000. The price Eleanor had placed on my attorney's loyalty. The number had a specificity that told me she had thought carefully about it, high enough to be tempting, low enough to be deniable as anything other than a personal loan, if it ever came to light. "Did you deposit it?" I asked. "No, I've kept it sealed, every cent." He pushed the envelope toward me. "It's yours. It's evidence." I picked it up. It was lighter than $150,000 had any right to feel. I turned it over once and set it in my inside jacket pocket. "Michael," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer as my attorney, not as my friend." He straightened slightly. "Go ahead." "If I tell you everything, the complete plan, every component, every person involved, and something goes wrong, can they compel you to testify against me?" He shook his head immediately. "Attorney-client privilege. Everything said in this room is protected. They cannot compel me to disclose a word of it." "Good." I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a legal pad of my own. On the top page I had written in pencil a single phrase I had been thinking about since 4:30 that morning. I turned the pad around and pushed it across the desk. Michael read it. His eyebrows rose slightly. He read it again. Then he looked up. "An irrevocable trust," he said. "In Virginia," I said, "once assets are transferred into an irrevocable trust, they are no longer considered part of the grantor's personal estate. They cannot be reached by a conservatorship. They cannot be seized in a legal proceeding against the grantor. They belong entirely and permanently to the trust and its designated beneficiaries." Michael's pen was already moving. "You've been researching this?" "Since before I married Eleanor," I said. He stopped writing. He looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts professional admiration and personal relief, the face of a man realizing the situation is more manageable than he had feared. "How long do you need?" he asked. 8 weeks, I said. "Maybe less. I need the trust documents drafted, executed, notarized, and recorded with Fairfax County before she files anything. Once it's recorded, it's public record, irrevocable, untouchable." Michael wrote for another 30 seconds. Then he set the pen down and looked at me directly. "Arthur, I have to ask. The plan you're describing, do you want me to know all of it, or just the legal component?" I had thought about this on the drive over in the 2 blocks between the car and the gray door on King Street, in the quiet of the staircase. I had thought about what Thomas had told me, that Eleanor was moving faster than expected. I had thought about Leo asleep under his crescent moon nightlight. I had thought about the specific vulnerability of a plan known completely by more than one person. "The legal component is your shield, Michael," I said. "But the blue binder I am compiling will be our sword. When the time comes, I will deliver the full evidence to you so you can present it to the judge at the exact moment they think they've won." I found Thomas at the Herndon site on a Wednesday morning, standing beside a concrete pour with a clipboard in one hand and a hard hat pushed back on his head at the angle he always wore. It slightly too far back, like a man who had made peace with the fact that safety equipment was not going to improve his thinking either way. He was arguing with a concrete supplier over a slump test reading, and he was winning because Thomas Garner had been winning arguments with concrete suppliers since before most of the crew on this site had started shaving. I waited until the supplier walked away, then crossed the site toward him. The ground was uneven, raw earth and plywood sheeting over the soft spots, and the air smelled like wet concrete and diesel exhaust, and the particular dusty heat of a Virginia summer morning that has decided to be serious about itself. Thomas saw me coming from 30 feet away. He watched me cross the site with the focused attention of a man recalibrating something. By the time I reached him, his expression had shifted from the controlled impatience of the concrete argument to something quieter and more alert. "You're walking straight," he said. "I've been walking straight for 70 years, Thomas. Last week in the office, you walked into the doorframe on your way out." He said it without accusation, just as a data point, the way he would note a measurement that did not match the drawing. I noticed. "I meant to do that," I said. He stared at me for 3 full seconds. Then something moved through his face, not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a man whose suspicion has just been confirmed in a direction he had hoped it wouldn't go. He looked around the site, noted the positions of the crew, and said, "Come with me." He led me to the site trailer, a battered aluminum rectangle at the edge of the property, with a portable air conditioner working very hard in one window, and a coffee maker that had seen better presidential administrations. He closed the door. The noise of the site dropped to a muffled hum. "How long?" he asked. "How long have I known, or how long has it been happening?" "Both," I told him. Not everything. I was keeping the trust documents and Michael's involvement in my half of the plan, the half that only I held complete. But I told him enough. The camera footage. The tea. Leo's warning. The performance I had been giving Eleanor and David for the past several weeks. The slightly too slow responses, the missed coasters, the repeated questions about what day it was. Thomas listened. The way he listened on a job site, when someone was describing a problem he was already forming a solution to. He did not pace. He did not interrupt. He stood with his arms crossed and his hard hat in his hand and his jaw tight, and when I finished, he uncrossed his arms and set the hard hat on the folding table beside the coffee maker. "I want to put my fist through something," he said. "I understand that. How can I help?" I had thought carefully about what to ask Thomas for specifically. Thomas was not a lawyer, and he was not an investigator, and he was not a man who operated well in the abstract. He was a man who could hold a structure together under load, who knew how to keep 30 people moving in the same direction without raising his voice, and who had been inside Miller architecture long enough to know where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking. "I need 2 things from you," I said. "The first is Sandra." Thomas's eyes moved slightly. Sandra Kowalski had been my executive secretary for 27 years. She had keys as psychesmamus to every filing cabinet in the building and a memory for document locations that I had come to rely on the way you rely on load tables, absolutely without checking twice. "What about her?" Thomas asked. "David has been bringing her documents to process. Financial authorizations, transfer requests, things that should be going through me. I think she's been handling them because he presents them as coming from me, and she has no reason to question that yet. I need you to find out what she's been given and whether she still has copies." Thomas nodded slowly. "And the second thing, co-trustee," I said. "I'm establishing a trust. I can't tell you the full details yet. That comes later when the documents are ready. But I need someone inside the company who can be named as a managing trustee. Someone the employees trust. Someone who will make sure the work continues and the people are taken care of regardless of what happens in a courtroom." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Outside the trailer, a forklift beeped twice and someone shouted a measurement across the site. "You're asking me to be responsible for the whole operation," he said. "Not just the builds, the people." "Yes." He picked up his hard hat, turned it over once in his hands. "Arthur, there's something I need to tell you first." His voice had dropped in a way that made the back of my neck tighten. Thomas Garner did not lower his voice unless the information required it. "David has been at the office," he said. "Not just the finance requests through Sandra. He's been coming in when you're not there. Last Tuesday, he met with the Kellerman Group." The Kellerman Group was our largest single client. 11 years, 4 major projects, a relationship I had built one handshake at a time, over a decade of consistent work. What did he tell them? I asked. My voice came out level. I was proud of that. He introduced himself as your successor, Thomas said. Said the company was in transition and that he would be their primary contact going forward. He told them you were stepping back for health reasons. He held my gaze. Phil Kellerman called me afterward. He was confused. He wanted to know if it was true. Something cold moved through my chest. David had not waited for the court process to play out. He was already positioning himself, already inserting himself into relationships that had taken me a decade to build, already rewriting the story of Miller architecture with himself at the center of it. What did you tell Kellerman? I asked. I told him there was no transition, that you were actively involved in all projects, and that any communication about company leadership should come directly from you. Thomas's jaw tightened. He seemed relieved. But Arthur David is moving faster than you might be accounting for. I thought about what Michael had said in the office on King Street. 8 weeks, maybe less. Maybe, then we move tonight, I said. Find Sandra. Don't tell her everything. Just tell her that I need to know what David has asked her to process, and that I need copies of everything she has. Tell her it's confidential and it comes directly from me. Thomas put his hard hat back on his head at its customary impractical angle. And if she asks why, tell her the truth, I said. Tell her I'm protecting the company. He nodded once. It was the nod of a man who had spent 30 years building things that were meant to last and had just been given one more thing worth building. At the trailer door, I stopped. Thomas, what you're doing being named trustee holding this together, it's not a small thing I'm asking. He pushed the door open. The heat and noise of the site rolled back in. No, he said, squinting into the morning sun. It's not small. That's why you asked me and not someone else. He walked back toward the concrete pour without looking back. Clipboard already raised, already calling out to the crew, already carrying the weight of a thing he had just agreed to hold. I was not there when Thomas knocked on Sandra Kowalski's door that evening. I know what happened because Thomas told me the following morning, sitting across from me in the same site trailer in Herndon, with 2 cups of coffee between us and the early crew not yet arrived. He told me the way Thomas tells everything, without embellishment, in the order it occurred, with the particular respect for sequence that comes from 30 years of reading construction schedules. Sandra lived in a brick colonial on Pickett Road in Fairfax, the kind of house that had been built in the 1970s and maintained with the steady, unshowy attention of a woman who believed that things worth having were worth keeping in good repair. She had planted roses along the front walk. Thomas noticed this because Thomas notices structural details in everything, including gardens. She answered the door before he finished knocking. She was still dressed, though it was past 8:30 in the dark slacks and cardigan she wore to the office, and she looked at Thomas on her porch with an expression that was not surprise. I wondered when someone was going to come, she said. Thomas told me that stopped him for a moment. He had prepared a careful, indirect opening, something about checking in, asking if she had noticed anything unusual at the office. He had not expected her to open the door already knowing why he was there. You'd better come in, she said. Her living room was orderly in the way that people's living rooms are orderly when they live alone and have decided that their home will reflect the standards they hold themselves to at work. Books arranged by subject on built-in shelves. A single reading lamp beside an armchair with a library book on the side table, spine up to hold the page. On the coffee table, a manila envelope that she had clearly placed there before Thomas arrived, because it was sitting in the center of the table with nothing else around it, the way you set something out when you have been deciding whether to give it to someone and have finally made up your mind. She sat in the armchair. Thomas sat on the couch. She looked at the envelope for a moment, then at him. David started coming to the office 6 weeks ago, she said. At first he said he was helping Mr. Miller with administrative overflow. He seemed to know the filing system well enough that I thought Arthur must have shown him around. She folded her hands in her lap. The first document he asked me to process was a vendor payment authorization. $62,000 to a contractor I had never heard of. He said Arthur had approved it verbally and just needed the paperwork run through. She paused. The signature on the authorization form did not look right to me. Thomas leaned forward. What do you mean did not look right? I have been processing Arthur's signatures for 27 years, Sandra said. Her voice was steady and precise, the voice of a woman who had spent nearly 3 decades being the most reliable person in any room she occupied. I know how he signs his name. I know which letters he connects and which he lifts the pen for and how much pressure he uses on the downstroke of the M. The signature on that form was close. It was very close. She looked at Thomas directly. It was not his. Thomas said the room was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of an impasse, but the purposeful quiet of 2 people who have just confirmed something they had each suspected separately. How many documents? Thomas asked. Sandra reached forward and picked up the manila envelope. She held it in both hands but did not open it yet. 11, she said. Over 6 weeks. Vendor authorizations and equipment lease transfer, 2 internal budget reallocations, and something called a preliminary ownership consultation form that I had never seen the template for before and could not find in any of our standard files. She set the envelope back on the table. I processed the first 3 before I understood what I was looking at. After that, I processed them on the surface and kept copies of everything in my personal files at home. Thomas asked her why she had not come forward sooner. Sandra's hands tightened slightly on the arms of the chair. Because I did not know who to trust, she said. David presented himself as acting on Arthur's behalf. If I accused him and I was wrong, I would be accusing the stepson of my employer of forgery based on my opinion of a signature. And if I was right, she stopped. If I was right, I did not know how far it went. Whether there were other people in the office involved. Whether going to the wrong person would make things worse for Arthur instead of better. She had spent 6 weeks carrying that calculation alone. I thought about that when Thomas told me. 27 years she had worked for me, and she had sat alone in this living room on Pickett Road every evening for 6 weeks with an envelope on her coffee table trying to determine whether the person she brought it to would help or harm. Thomas picked up the envelope. May I? She nodded. He opened it and looked through the contents. 11 photocopied documents. Each one had a small yellow sticky note in the upper corner in Sandra's handwriting, the date it was presented, who had brought it, and a 1-line description of what it purported to authorize. At the bottom of the stack, a separate sheet with a list of the same 11 documents in chronological order with running totals. The financial documents alone represented $430,000 in unauthorized transactions. The equipment lease transfer had moved 3 CNC fabrication units, worth roughly $200,000, into a shell company Thomas did not recognize. The preliminary ownership consultation form appeared to be laying groundwork for a claim that David had been involved in company management for over a year. Thomas set the documents back in the envelope carefully, the way you handle something that is going to matter in a room with the judge present. Sandra, he said, I need to take these tonight. The originals stay with you locked where you have them. These copies come with me. She nodded once. No negotiation, no hesitation. 27 years of being the most reliable person in the room had prepared her for exactly this moment, even if she had not known it. Is Arthur all right? She asked. Her voice did not waver, but something shifted underneath it, the particular concern of a person who has worked alongside someone long enough that their well-being has become genuinely, quietly important. Thomas stood and tucked the envelope under his arm. "He's more than all right," he said. "He just needed to know who he could count on." Sandra walked him to the door. On the porch, Thomas stopped and looked back at her. "You should know," he said, "what you did keeping those copies, tracking the dates, sitting on this, instead of panicking. That's what's going to hold this whole thing together." Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I've been keeping Arthur Miller's records straight for 27 years. I wasn't going to stop now." She closed the door. Thomas stood on the porch for a moment among the roses, the manila envelope under his arm, and the night air cool around him, and then he walked back to his truck and drove directly to my house and knocked on the workshop door at 10:14 that evening. I opened it. He handed me the envelope without a word. I looked at the running total Sandra had written at the bottom of her list. $430,000. I looked at the equipment lease transfer. I looked at the ownership consultation form. Then I walked to my workbench, opened the flat drawer beneath it, and took out the blue leather binder I had purchased 3 weeks earlier at an office supply store on Route 50 in Chantilly, paying cash. I placed Sandra's envelope inside. Carol Nguyen had been Margaret's doctor first. After Margaret died, she became mine, and somewhere in the years between then and now, she had become something closer to a trusted colleague than a physician. A person whose judgment I respected, not because she had credentials on her wall, which she did, but because she had never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. I called her office from the payphone on Ashford Road on a Thursday morning and asked for the earliest available appointment outside regular scheduling. Her receptionist, who knew my voice, put me through directly. Carol picked up on the second ring. "Arthur," she said, "I've been waiting for you to call." That was the second time in a week that someone had opened a door, already knowing why I was standing on the other side of it. I was beginning to understand that the people I had built relationships with over decades had been paying attention in ways I had not fully accounted for. I arrived at her office the following Monday morning at 7:15 before the waiting room filled. She met me at the door herself rather than having the receptionist bring me back, which told me she had cleared space around this appointment that she did not want interrupted. Her office smelled like the particular combination of coffee and antiseptic that I had always found oddly reassuring, the smell of a place where problems were taken seriously. She was a small woman, perhaps 5'3", with dark hair going silver at the temples, and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead when she was not using them. She had the physical stillness of someone who had learned through years of delivering difficult information to frightened people that calm was not a feeling, but a practice. I sat across from her desk and placed a small Ziploc bag on the surface between us. Inside was approximately 1 tablespoon of the tea mixture I had removed from the canister before making the swap enough for a chemical analysis, not enough to be missed. "I need you to have this analyzed," I said, "independently, not through any lab that David or Eleanor could access or influence." She picked up the bag and held it to the light from the window. "How long have you been drinking this?" "Approximately 5 weeks before I made the swap." I stopped the night I identified what was happening. She set the bag down and looked at me with the focused attention she used when she was deciding whether a symptom was what it appeared to be or something else wearing its clothes. "Arthur, the last time you came in 6 weeks ago, the appointment Eleanor scheduled your cognitive assessment showed early markers that concerned me. Response latency, mild disorientation on the spatial reasoning portion." She folded her hands on the desk. "Those markers did not match any progression pattern I recognize from 15 years of monitoring your health. They appeared too suddenly, and in a combination I have not seen in a patient with your baseline." "Meaning they looked induced rather than organic," I said. meaning I did not feel comfortable signing off on them as a confirmed diagnosis, she said carefully. I told Eleanor at the conclusion of that appointment that I wanted to run additional tests before drawing any conclusions. She pushed back harder than I would have expected from a concerned spouse. She paused. She told me that waiting was dangerous, that you needed intervention immediately, that she had already consulted with another physician. Something tightened across my shoulders. Eleanor had not mentioned another physician to me. She had not mentioned that Carol Nguyen had expressed any reservations about the assessment. She had come home from that appointment and told me over dinner that the doctor agreed the situation was concerning and that she was glad they had gone in when they did. Carol? I said, has anyone else contacted your office about my records recently? She held my gaze for a moment longer than the question required. Then she reached into the top drawer of her desk and withdrew a manila folder. She did not open it. She set it on the desk beside the Ziploc bag and kept her hand flat on top of it. 3 weeks ago, she said, a man came to this office and identified himself as your son. He said he was accompanying you on an appointment that had been scheduled under a different name for privacy reasons. He said you were in the waiting room. She watched my face as she said this. When I came out to the waiting room, there was no one there matching your description. The man David, I assume, was alone. My jaw tightened. David had not only come to her office. He had come with a prepared story, a cover for why Arthur Miller was not actually present at Arthur Miller's appointment. What did he ask for? I said. He asked me to update your medical records to reflect a diagnosis of moderate stage dementia with onset approximately 18 months ago. Her voice remained steady and precise the way a person's voice is steady and precise when they have rehearsed saying a difficult thing and are now saying it in the actual room where it matters. He said you had been reluctant to have it formally documented and that the family needed the official record for legal proceedings. He used that phrase specifically. Legal proceedings. The room was very quiet. On Gallows Road below us, traffic moved with the ordinary indifference of a Tuesday morning that had no idea what was happening 3 floors above it. I refused, Carol said. I told him that I could not alter a patient's medical record based on a family member's account, that any diagnosis required direct examination of the patient, and that if he had concerns about his father's health, he was welcome to schedule an appointment through proper channels with the patient's written consent. She paused. He became agitated. He told me I was making a mistake. He said that by the time this was resolved in court, I would wish I had cooperated. She opened the folder. Inside were 2 printed pages, a summary of the conversation she had written immediately after David left, and a still image from the security camera in the waiting area showing David at the reception desk. The timestamp read 3:47 in the afternoon 3 weeks ago. Our office installed security cameras 2 years ago after a prescription fraud incident, she said. The camera in the waiting area captures audio as well as video. Everything he said at the reception desk is recorded. She slid both pages across the desk toward me. I printed these the day after he came in. I have been waiting to understand what the appropriate next step was. I picked up the pages. The still image showed David in a sport coat I recognized he had worn it to dinner at the house the week before, leaning across the reception desk with the particular posture of a man who was accustomed to getting what he asked for and was encountering unexpected resistance. I placed both pages inside my jacket pocket beside the envelope from Michael. Carol, I said, I need the original recording, the written summary, and the chemical analysis of this tea, all prepared as formal documentation. Signed, dated, certified if possible. I anticipated that, she said. She opened the drawer again and withdrew a second folder. I had the recording transferred to a secure drive yesterday. The written summary is already notarized. She placed the second folder on the desk. The chemical analysis will take 10 days. I'm using an independent toxicology service in Richmond that has no affiliation with any hospital or practice in Northern Virginia. I looked at her across the desk. 15 years. She had been paying attention for 15 years, and she had been ready for this conversation before I arrived to have it. "Arthur," she said, and for the first time her clinical precision gave way slightly, just at the edges, the way a well-built wall shows the first hairline sign of movement in extreme weather. "I want you to tell me honestly. Are you safe at home right now?" I thought about Leo asleep under his crescent moon nightlight. I thought about the blue binder in the flat drawer of my workbench. I thought about Thomas and Sandra and Michael, each holding a piece of something that was beginning to take the shape of what I needed it to be on. "I have 6 weeks," I said. "I will be." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she closed both folders, stacked them neatly, and slid them across the desk to me. "Then you had better not waste any of them," she said. The trust documents arrived from Michael's office on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of August, delivered by courier to my office at Miller Architecture, rather than to the house on Willow Creek Drive. Michael had used a courier service I had not seen him use before, a small outfit on Duke Street in Alexandria, rather than the large national service his office used for routine correspondence. The package was addressed to me by name with no firm letterhead on the outside. I signed for it myself and carried it upstairs to my private office and locked the door. I had been waiting for these documents for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, I had continued to drink chamomile tea from Margaret's old canister every evening, while the green tin sat undisturbed beside the kitchen kettle, its replaced contents performing their original function of tasting like wet bark. I had continued to miss coasters by 2 inches and ask David what day it was, and pause slightly too long before responding to questions Eleanor asked me at dinner. I had gotten better at the performance as the weeks passed, which I found I did not particularly enjoy noticing about myself. It is not a comfortable thing to discover how thoroughly you can deceive people who live under the same roof. I spread the documents across my desk and read them from the first page to the last, the way I read a full set of construction drawings, before signing off on them, not looking for errors, because I trusted Michael's work, but because understanding every element of a structure before you commit to building it is not optional. It is the difference between a building that stands and one that tells you what it didn't know about itself too late to fix. The Miller Legacy Trust was 23 pages long. Michael had drafted it as an irrevocable trust under Virginia Code, Section 64.2, meaning that once I executed and recorded it, I could not revoke it, modify it unilaterally, or reclaim the assets transferred into it. Those assets would no longer be mine in any legal sense. They would belong to the trust and to the trust's designated beneficiaries, managed according to the conditions I had specified, beyond the reach of any conservatorship, any creditor claim, and any petition for guardianship over my personal estate. The beneficiary was Leo Arthur Miller, currently age 7, to receive full control of all trust assets upon reaching his 21st birthday. The co-trustees were 3. Thomas Garner, site superintendent and 30-year employee of Miller Architecture, responsible for operational continuity of the firm. The Virginia Children's Welfare Foundation, a nonprofit organization based in Richmond, with a 20-year record of independent oversight in cases involving minor beneficiaries responsible for ensuring Leo's personal welfare and educational provision. And First Commonwealth Bank of Northern Virginia, serving as independent financial trustee, responsible for account management and annual reporting. No single trustee could act unilaterally. All significant decisions required majority agreement among the 3. The company could not be sold, dissolved, or relocated outside Northern Virginia without unanimous trustee approval. A minimum of 80% of current full-time employees were to be retained through any operational transition. The veteran hiring program Thomas had built over 12 years was to be maintained as a condition of trust compliance. I had left myself exactly $10,000 in my personal checking account and one vehicle, a 2011 Ford pickup with 114,000 miles on it, that I had been meaning to trade in for 3 years and had never gotten around to. Everything else, the company, the building on Willow Creek Drive, the architectural copyright portfolio, the investment accounts, the equipment had been transferred into the trust. If Eleanor and David wanted Arthur Miller's personal assets, they were welcome to them. I signed the execution pages in the presence of the notary Michael had arranged, a woman named Patricia who worked out of a UPS store on Chain Bridge Road, and who stamped my documents with the efficient disinterest of a person who notarized things all day and had long since stopped wondering what they were for. The recording with Fairfax County had been completed the previous Friday. The trust was already public record. It had been public record for 5 days, sitting quietly in the county files, waiting. I gathered everything from my desk. Carol Nguyen's toxicology report had arrived the previous Thursday. The independent lab in Richmond had identified the compound as scopolamine, a prescription anticholinergic medication used in controlled doses for motion sickness and nausea, but capable of producing significant cognitive impairment, memory disruption, and confusion when administered repeatedly at elevated doses without medical supervision. The report was 12 pages, signed by a board-certified toxicologist, whose name I did not know, and whose credentials I had verified through the Virginia Medical Licensing Board website the morning after the report arrived. I placed the toxicology report in the blue binder first, then Carol's written summary of David's visit to her office, then the secure drive, then Sandra's photocopied documents with her handwritten index, then the cashier's check from Eleanor still in its original envelope, still sealed, then the video file from my home camera system copied to a second secure drive that Michael had provided. Then the trust documents themselves, the executed originals. I closed the binder. The blue leather cover was soft under my hands. I had chosen it for that reason, because I wanted the object to have a physical quality that matched what it contained. Something that felt considered. Something that felt like it had been made to last. I carried it to the flat drawer beneath my workbench and placed it inside and locked the drawer with the small key I kept on a separate ring from my office keys. Leo appeared in the doorway of the workshop at 8:47. He was in his pajamas again, the rocket ship's ones he had almost outgrown, and he was holding Captain by the ear. "You're working late again," he said. "I am," I said. I was sitting on the stool at the workbench with my hands flat on the surface, doing nothing in particular, which is the thing you do when you have just finished something that took everything you had and you are not yet ready to stand up and be ordinary again. He crossed the workshop and climbed onto the stool beside me the way he always did and looked at the blank surface of the workbench where I wasn't working. "Are you almost done?" he asked. "With the broken building?" The question hit me somewhere behind the sternum, the way his questions occasionally did, arriving at the exact center of the thing, without knowing that was what they were doing. "Yes," I said. "I think I'm almost done." He leaned his head against my arm. Captain dangled from his hand, one-eyed and patient. "Good," Leo said, "because I'm tired of you being worried." I put my arm around him and held on for a moment, the way you hold on to something you have just finished protecting and are only now allowing yourself to feel the weight of. Outside the workshop window, the August night was warm and still and smelled like cut grass, and the particular sweetness of the Bradford pear trees along the fence line that Eleanor had complained about twice since moving in, and that I had no intention of removing. My phone buzzed on the workbench. A message from Michael. 4 words. Recorded and confirmed, Friday. I looked at it for a moment. Then I set the phone face down and looked at the top of Leo's head instead. Go to sleep, I said. Everything is going to be fine. This time I meant it completely. Eleanor told me about the petition on a Sunday evening in the first week of September at the kitchen table over a dinner. She had cooked herself pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the kind of meal that announces its own domesticity, that says, "Look how much I care about you," without requiring any evidence beyond the fact of the food. She had set the table with the good placemats. She had opened a bottle of Cabernet that had been in the wine rack since the previous Christmas. She had sent Leo to eat in the family room with a plate and a movie, which she framed as a treat, and which I understood immediately as a removal. She waited until I had finished eating. I will give her that. She did not ambush me over the pot roast. She waited until I had set my fork down, and she had refilled my wine glass, and the kitchen was quiet, except for the muffled sound of Leo's movie from the next room, and then she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "Arthur," she said, "David and I have been talking to someone, a legal specialist, about your care." I looked at her hand on mine. Her nails were painted the pale, neutral color she always wore, and her wedding ring caught the light from the pendant lamp above the table, and everything about the presentation was so carefully calibrated that I felt a cold, clear admiration for the architecture of it, even as I understood exactly what it was. "A legal specialist," I said. I let my voice carry the faint upward drift of a man who has heard a phrase but is not entirely certain what it means. "A conservatorship attorney," she said. "It is a legal arrangement that allows family members to help manage things when someone we love is having difficulty managing on their own." She said it the way you explain something to a child patiently, without condescension in the tone, but with condescension in the assumption that the explanation was necessary. "It does not mean anything is wrong with you, Arthur. It just means that David and I want to make sure you are protected." David appeared in this kitchen doorway on cue, the timing so precise that I knew he had been listening. For the moment she said the word conservatorship. He was carrying his own wine glass and wearing the expression of a man attempting to project reluctant concern and not quite getting the reluctant part right. "We've already spoken with an attorney," he said. "Charles Benton. He's one of the best conservatorship lawyers in Northern Virginia. His office is handling the paperwork." He paused. "We just need you to know we're doing this because we love you, not because we want anything for ourselves." The sentence landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of a lie that has been rehearsed until the liar can no longer hear it as a lie. I looked at David over the rim of my wine glass and thought about the Kellerman Group and the shell company on Sandra's document list and the 11 forged signatures and the appointment at Carol Nguyen's office and the cashier's check for $150,000 that was currently sitting in a locked drawer in my workshop. "I understand," I said. I picked up my wine glass and set it down 2 inches to the left of the coaster. "Whatever you think is best." Eleanor's shoulders dropped by a fraction. David exhaled through his nose. The kitchen relaxed around them the way a structure relaxes when the load it has been bracing against is removed. I excused myself at 8:30, saying I was tired, and went upstairs. In the hallway outside Leo's room, I stopped and listened to the movie still playing, and Leo's small laugh at something on screen, and I held on to that sound for a moment, before continuing to the bedroom. Charles Benton filed the conservatorship petition with the Fairfax County Circuit Court on a Tuesday morning 11 days later. I know the exact date because Michael called me at the office at 10:43 to tell me, and I wrote the date in the margin of the drawing I had been working on when the phone rang, a preliminary elevation for a small library in Herndon that I had been developing between everything else, because stopping work entirely would have been a deviation from character that Eleanor might have noticed and questioned. The petition alleged moderate cognitive decline with onset, 18 months prior, citing the assessment from Dr. Hargrove, The physician Eleanor had taken me to see, not Carol and Gwen, and 3 signed witness statements from individuals I did not recognize attesting to observed episodes of confusion and disorientation. It requested that Eleanor Miller and David Marsh be appointed co-conservators of my personal estate and granted authority to make financial and medical decisions on my behalf. It did not mention Miller Architecture by name. It did not need to. Control of my personal estate combined with the assumption that the company was part of that estate was sufficient for their purposes. Michael told me all of this in the flat, careful voice he used when he was delivering information he wanted me to receive without reacting to. The petition has been assigned to Judge Rebecca Lane, he said. She's been on the Fairfax bench for 19 years. Solid record. Fair. A pause. Her clerk called this morning to say she's requesting an independent medical evaluation before scheduling a hearing. That's standard, but it also means she's not rubber stamping this. That detail mattered. A judge who wanted independent evaluation before proceeding was a judge who was reading the file rather than processing it. What's the timeline? I asked. She'll sign a temporary administrative order this week to acknowledge the petition is under review. The full hearing won't be scheduled for at least 6 weeks. Another pause. Arthur, are you ready? I looked at the preliminary elevation on my desk. Clean lines. Natural light from the north-facing clerestory windows I had specified. A building designed to welcome people who needed a quiet place to think. I've been ready since August, I said. Judge Rebecca Lane signed the temporary administrative order on a Thursday afternoon. It did not grant Eleanor any authority over my affairs. It simply acknowledged that the petition had been filed and was under review, and it required that a court-appointed physician conduct an independent cognitive assessment within 30 days. It was a procedural step, nothing more. But Eleanor received a copy of the order that evening through Benton's office, and she called David from the kitchen while I was in the workshop, and her voice through the house carried the particular quality of someone who has just received the first confirmation that a plan they have been building for months is finally becoming real. I sat at my workbench and listened to her voice rise and fall through the walls of the house I had designed, and I thought about the blue binder in the locked drawer 2 feet from where I was sitting, and I thought about 6 weeks, and I thought about Leo asleep upstairs under his crescent moon nightlight. 3 more weeks, I thought. Let them believe they have already won. Outside the workshop window, the Bradford pear trees along the fence line had begun to turn, the first edges of yellow appearing at the tips of the leaves, the way fall always announced itself in Northern Virginia, not all at once, but gradually, one detail at a time until the whole picture was different from what it had been. I did not know Rebecca Lane personally. What I knew about her I had learned afterward, pieced together from what Michael told me, and from a conversation I had with her briefly outside the courthouse on the day everything ended. But I am going to tell you what happened in her chambers in September, because it matters to understanding how the final hearing unfolded, and because she deserves more than a footnote in this account. Rebecca Lane had been a judge in Fairfax County for 19 years. She had presided over conservatorship cases before more than she liked to count. She told me later because the volume of them had increased steadily over the past decade, as the population aged and the legal mechanisms for managing that aging became more familiar to attorneys who specialized in finding ways to use them. She had learned over those 19 years to read a petition the way an experienced builder reads a set of drawings, not just for what was there, but for what should have been there and wasn't. Then she read the full assessment. Then she set it down and picked up the second folder and read the witness statements, 3 of them, each describing specific incidents of observed confusion or disorientation in Arthur Miller over a period of approximately 14 months. She put the witness statements down and looked at the physician assessment again. The assessment was dated 8 weeks prior, It noted moderate cognitive decline with estimated onset 18 months earlier. It cited specific deficits in short-term memory, spatial reasoning, and executive function. It was signed by a physician named Gerald Hargrove, whose credentials Rebecca Lane recognized as legitimate. She had seen his name on other assessments filed in her court over the previous several years. But something was wrong with the document, and it took her 11 minutes of looking at it before she identified what it was. The assessment noted onset 18 months prior. It documented a progression consistent with that timeline. But it contained no reference to any prior assessments, no notation of previous appointments at which early markers had been observed, no mention of any other physician who had been monitoring the patient's condition as it developed. A patient with an 18-month history of cognitive decline presenting to a physician for a formal assessment would typically arrive with some record of that history. A referral note, a summary from a primary care physician, something that connected the current assessment to the documented past. There was nothing. The assessment existed in isolation, complete and confident, and entirely without context. Rebecca Lane picked up her phone and called the licensing board number she kept on a card in her top drawer. She asked for confirmation that Gerald Hargrove held an active medical license in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He did not. Gerald Hargrove had retired from active practice 8 months prior and had allowed his Virginia license to lapse at the time of his retirement. She set the phone down and looked at the assessment again. It had been signed 4 weeks after Gerald Hargrove's license lapsed. She did not call Benton's office. She did not call Eleanor Miller or David Marsh or anyone connected to the petition. She pulled a fresh legal pad from her desk drawer and wrote 3 lines on it in her own handwriting, the kind of handwriting that people who have spent decades signing court orders develop clear, deliberate, no wasted motion. Physician license lapsed at time of signature. No prior assessment record. No primary care referral. Then she wrote a 4th line, underlined it, and set the pen down. Request independent evaluation. Attend final hearing in person. She called her clerk into chambers and instructed her to add the independent evaluation requirement to the temporary administrative order and to block time on her calendar for the final hearing date whenever it was scheduled, regardless of what else was on the docket that day. Her clerk, who had worked with Rebecca Lane for 11 years and had learned to recognize the particular quality of attention the judge brought to a case she intended to watch closely, asked no questions. She simply wrote down the instructions and left. I learned all of this from Michael, who learned parts of it from the court file and other parts from a brief conversation with Lane's clerk after the final hearing. I learned the rest from Rebecca Lane herself, standing outside courtroom 3 on a cold November morning, while the parking lot filled with people who had come to watch something they had not expected to see. She told me she had noticed the license issue within the first hour of reading the file. I asked her why she had not flagged it, immediately referred the matter to someone else, escalated it through whatever channels existed for exactly this kind of situation. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of a person who has spent 19 years watching the gap between what the law says and what actually happens to people inside it. Because flagging it would have alerted Benton, she said. And if Benton knew I had found the problem, he would have had time to find a way around it. What I needed was to understand how deep it went before anyone knew I was looking. She had spent 6 weeks understanding how deep it went. She had done it quietly through proper channels without alerting anyone connected to the petition. She had requested the independent evaluation not because the procedures required it, though they did, but because she wanted a clean, untainted medical record in the file before the final hearing. Something that could not be explained away or amended after the fact. And she had put the hearing on her personal calendar because 19 years had given her a sense for the cases that were going to matter, the ones where what happened in the courtroom would determine something real about someone's actual life, rather than just resolving a procedural dispute between parties who could absorb whatever outcome the court delivered. Arthur Miller, she told me, had not looked like a man who could absorb a bad outcome. She was right about that. But she did not yet know that the outcome had already been determined in a workshop on Willow Creek Drive in a blue leather binder sitting in a locked drawer weeks before anyone walked into her courtroom. I wish I could have told her that. I think she would have appreciated it. What I said instead, standing in the cold November parking lot, with the hearing just concluded, and the Bradford pear trees along the courthouse fence line bare and skeletal against a gray sky, was simply this. "Thank you for looking carefully," I said. She nodded once. "That's the job," she said, and walked back inside. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep. Not because I was afraid, though there was something that lived in the same neighborhood as fear moving through me that evening. It was closer to what I feel in the hours before a major project presentation, that particular state of suspended alertness, where every detail you have prepared comes back to you in sequence, and you check each one against the others to confirm that the structure holds, that nothing has been forgotten. That the thing you are about to show the world is as solid as you believe it to be. I had checked everything twice by 10 o'clock. The blue binder was with Michael transferred in a locked briefcase the previous Friday through the same courier service on Duke Street in Alexandria. Michael had confirmed receipt in a text message that said only received and that I had deleted immediately afterward. The trust recording was public record in Fairfax County, had been for nearly 3 months, and was not going anywhere. Carol Nguyen's toxicology report and the documentation from her office were included in the binder. Sandra's documents were included. The home camera footage was included. The cashier's check from Eleanor, still sealed in its original envelope, was included. I had done everything I could do. The structure was built. What remained was to watch it stand. At 11:15, I checked on Leo. He was asleep on his side with one arm around Captain, and the crescent moon nightlight casting its familiar blue across the wall above his bed. He had grown since June, I noticed it, in the particular way you notice growth in children. You see every day not as a single observation, but as an accumulation of small ones that suddenly resolve into a fact. His feet reached further down the mattress than they had at the beginning of summer. His face had lost some of the roundness that very young children carry, and was beginning to show the angles of the person he was becoming. I stood in the doorway for longer than I had any practical reason to. I thought about Claire. I thought about the phone call on that wet November morning 4 years ago, the way Michael's voice had sounded when he told me the drive to the hospital that I did not fully remember, because some part of my mind had decided that the details of that drive were not something it was willing to retain. I thought about the room where I had sat for 6 hours, waiting for information that kept not arriving, and the way the fluorescent light above the waiting room chairs had flickered every 40 seconds, with the reliability of something that had been broken for a long time, and that nobody had gotten around to fixing. I thought about what Claire had said to me the last time I had seen her 3 weeks before the accident, standing in the kitchen of her apartment in Arlington, with Leo on her hip and a dish towel over her shoulder. She had been telling me about a problem at work, something about a contractor and a deadline, and in the middle of explaining it, she had looked at me with the direct, unguarded look she had used since she was 7 years old, and said, "Dad, promise me Leo will always have a home." I had said, "Of course." The way you say "of course" when you mean it completely, and also when you do not yet understand the specific weight the promise is going to carry. Now I understood. It had taken 4 years and a conservatorship petition, and a blue leather binder full of evidence, and a scopolamine compound dissolved in herbal tea, but I understood. I crossed the room and sat on the edge of Leo's bed. He stirred, but did not wake. I put my hand lightly on his back and felt the slow rise and fall of his breathing, and stayed there for a while without moving or thinking about anything in particular, just present in the room with him. Which was the thing Claire had asked me to be, and the thing I intended to go on being for as long as I was able. At midnight, I went downstairs to the kitchen and made a cup of actual chamomile tea, Margaret's chamomile from the canister that had been behind her books for 2 winters, and sat at the kitchen island, with it cooling in my hands, and thought about the hearing. Benton would present first. He would be organized and confident, and he would use Eleanor's carefully constructed record of my supposed decline to build a case that appeared from the outside airtight. Eleanor would testify. She would be composed and sorrowful in equal measure, and she would describe a husband whose mind was slipping away from him and whom she only wanted to protect. David would sit behind her with the posture of a dutiful son and the expression of a man who had already mentally spent money he had not yet received. Michael would say we had no objection. The room would tilt. People would think it was over. And then the blue binder would come out of the briefcase. I sat with that image for a while. Not with satisfaction, not exactly. Satisfaction was not quite the right word for what I felt about what was going to happen in courtroom 3 in the morning. What I felt was something closer to the feeling I had when I looked at a completed building for the first time, the strange, quiet combination of relief that it was standing and grief that the work of building it was done. My phone buzzed on the island. Michael. A text that read, "Blue box is secured. See you at 9. I looked at it for a moment. Then I set the phone face down and looked at the kitchen instead. The good placemats still on the table from Eleanor's Sunday dinner 3 weeks ago. The green tin canister beside the kettle with its replaced and harmless contents. The pendant lamp above the table casting the same yellow light it always had. I thought about a thing I had read once years ago in a book about structural engineering that Margaret had given me for our anniversary, because she had understood even then that the books I wanted most were the ones that described how things held together under pressure. The book had said that the strongest structures are not the ones built to resist every possible force. They are the ones built to transfer force to take what comes at them and move it through themselves and into the ground without breaking. The resistance is in the design, not in the rigidity. I had spent 40 years building structures that transferred force. I had spent the last 5 months building one more. I rinsed my mug, set it in the drying rack, the way I had done every night for 11 years in this kitchen, and went upstairs. In the hallway, I stopped outside Leo's door. The crescent moon nightlight glowed blue beneath the door. Inside, the slow sound of his breathing. I had a piece of drafting paper in my shirt pocket. I kept one there out of habit, the way some men keep a handkerchief. I took it out and unfolded it on my palm. With a pencil from the hall table, I drew a small, simple house. 4 walls, a roof, a door. The kind of house a child draws. Under it, I wrote 4 words. For Leo, always yours. I folded it and slipped it under his door. Then I went to bed, closed my eyes, and waited for morning. The Fairfax County Courthouse parking garage smelled like exhaust and cold concrete, and I sat in my truck for 4 minutes after turning off the engine, looking at the steering wheel, doing nothing in particular. The Ford had 114,000 miles on it, and a crack in the dashboard that had appeared the previous winter, and that I had never gotten around to having fixed. It was, as of the previous August, one of only 2 things in the world that belonged to me personally. I had grown unreasonably fond of it. I got out at 8:43 and walked to the courthouse entrance alone. Michael was waiting in the lobby with his briefcase and a coffee he had not yet opened. He looked as he always looked before something important, not nervous exactly, but concentrated the way a load-bearing element looks when it is carrying exactly what it was designed to carry and knows it. He handed me the coffee. We did not need to say much. We had said everything there was to say, in a locked office on King Street 4 months ago, and everything since then had been preparation, and the preparation was done. The hallway outside courtroom 3 was already crowded when we arrived at 8:55. I recognized Thomas immediately. He was standing against the far wall in his good suit, the dark navy one he wore to project presentations and retirement parties, and beside him stood 11 men and women I had worked alongside for between 8 and 31 years. They were not there because Thomas had organized them. They were there because word had traveled through Miller architecture, the way word travels through any structure, under stress, along the lines of connection, following the load path. I shook Thomas's hand. He gripped it hard and let go without making a production of it, which was exactly right. I did not see Judge Rebecca Lane in the hallway. I would find out later that she had entered through the side corridor that connected to the clerk's office, arriving before the gallery opened, taking a seat in the back row, without speaking to anyone or identifying herself to the court staff. She had a copy of the case file in her lap, and a yellow legal pad and a pen, and she sat with the focused stillness of a woman who had decided this was where she needed to be today. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor and Benton were already at the petitioner's table. Eleanor wore the gray suit she had worn to our first dinner with the Kellerman group 3 years ago, which told me she had chosen it deliberately, a costume from a moment of success worn to conjure that success again. Her pearls were the ones she wore when she wanted to appear trustworthy to people who associated pearls with trustworthiness. Benton had 4 accordion folders arranged on the table in the color-coded order I had been told to expect, and he was reviewing notes in a leather portfolio with the unhurried confidence of a man whose preparation was complete and whose outcome was certain. Eleanor looked at me when I came in. She held my gaze for 2 seconds with an expression that combined pity and something harder underneath it, something that had nothing to do with pity. Then she looked away. I sat down at the respondent's table, my charcoal suit, my hands folded, my eyes at that fixed point on the floor, 2 feet in front of my shoes, the same point I had been looking at for months whenever Eleanor or David was watching. The performance. The last time I would ever have to give it. Leo was not in the courtroom. He was at school where he belonged on a Tuesday morning with his rocket ship backpack and his one-eyed stuffed dog left at home on the bed, and a note from me in his lunchbox that said simply, "Today is a good day." He would know what it meant when I told him tonight. Judge Helen Whitaker entered at 9 o'clock with the punctuality of a person who considered lateness a form of disrespect to everyone in the room. Everyone rose. She settled at the bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the case file without preliminary remarks. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with silver hair and a manner that communicated without requiring words that she had heard every version of every argument before and was interested only in the one that was supported by evidence. Benton rose and opened for the petitioners. He was good. I had been told he was good, and he was in the specific way that expensive attorneys are good, not through insight or creativity, but through the sheer density of preparation, the ability to present a case so thoroughly that the gaps in it became invisible to everyone, except the people who already knew where they were. He walked Judge Whitaker through the assessment from Dr. Hargrove. He presented the 3 witness statements. He showed a brief video clip recorded on David's phone of me standing in the doorway of the downstairs bathroom on a Tuesday afternoon in July, looking confused about which direction I had been heading. I remembered that afternoon. I had been practicing the look for 6 minutes before David appeared in the hallway with his phone already raised. Eleanor took the stand. She pressed a tissue against the corner of her right eye, and her voice broke on the word home, and her hand trembled slightly when she described watching me struggle to find the right word at dinner. Every gesture was calibrated. Every pause landed where it was intended to land. She was giving the performance of her life, and I watched her give it from the respondent's table, with my jaw slightly slack, and my eyes slightly unfocused, and my hands folded in my lap, and I thought about the cashier's check in the blue binder, and Carol Nguyen's photograph of David at the reception desk, and Sandra's handwritten index of 11 forged documents. Benton rested the petitioner's case at 10:22. He buttoned his jacket and sat down with the satisfied motion of a man setting down a heavy thing he has been carrying successfully. Judge Whitaker looked toward the respondent's table. "Mr. Ross, does the respondent wish to address the court?" Michael stood. He straightened his jacket with the small, precise movement he always made before saying something he had decided mattered. He looked at Judge Whitaker with the steady, undemonstrative directness that had made him effective in courtrooms for 22 years. "Your Honor," he said, "the respondent has no objection to the petition." The courtroom tilted. I felt it, rather than saw it, the collective shift of 30 people recalibrating what they thought they were watching. Someone in the gallery drew a breath. Thomas went very still against the wall. Benton looked up from his notes with an expression that had not yet decided what it was feeling. Eleanor turned her head toward me by 3 degrees. Just 3. Controlled, careful, almost imperceptible. But her right hand resting on the table in front of her closed into a loose fist. She thought it was over. She had no idea it had not yet begun. The moment Eleanor heard Michael say, "We had no objection," something shifted in her posture that was almost architectural in its clarity. Her spine straightened by a fraction. Her chin lifted by a degree. The careful performance of grief she had been maintaining for the past hour relaxed at its edges the way a muscle relaxes when it has been holding a position and is finally permitted to release. She did not smile. She was too disciplined for that. But the absence of the smile she was suppressing was visible to anyone who knew what to look for, and I had been watching Eleanor for long enough to know exactly what to look for. David was less disciplined. He exhaled through his nose in a single controlled burst, and then pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling. For half a second, the gesture of a man receiving news he has been waiting for and is trying not to celebrate visibly. His right knee, which had been bouncing since we entered the courtroom, went still for the first time all morning. Benton leaned toward Eleanor and said something I could not hear. She nodded once. He straightened open the top folder on the table and withdrew a document that he carried to the clerk's desk with the measured pace of a man delivering something he considers a formality. Judge Whitaker received the document from the clerk and read it briefly. "This is the conservatorship acceptance and fiduciary oath," she said. "Before this court enters a final order, both petitioners are required to execute this document in the presence of the court, acknowledging their legal responsibility as co-conservators of the respondent's personal estate and their obligation to manage those assets in the respondent's best interest." She looked at Eleanor and then at David. "Do both petitioners understand and accept these terms?" Eleanor said yes, without hesitation. Her voice was steady and clear, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment and was performing it exactly as rehearsed. David said yes with slightly more force than necessary, the way people say yes when they are not just agreeing, but celebrating. Benton brought the document to the petitioner's table. Eleanor picked up the pen he offered, a silver ballpoint. Her own the kind of detail she managed, and signed her name in the large, confident cursive she always used for anything she considered important. She pressed the pen into David's hand when she finished, and he signed beneath her faster, his signature sprawling across the line, with the loose energy of someone who could not quite contain how good this felt. Benton retrieved the document and carried it back to the clerk. I watched from the respondent's table with my hands folded in my lap, and my expression carrying the mild, unfocused quality I had been maintaining since 9 o'clock. My jaw was slightly slack. My eyes were pointed at the middle distance beyond the petitioner's table. I was to anyone watching a 70-year-old man with compromised cognition who had just consented to having his affairs managed by his wife and stepson because he lacked the capacity to manage them himself. Beneath the table, my right hand was completely still. Michael waited until the clerk had the signed document in hand. He waited until Benton had returned to his seat and opened his portfolio as though preparing for whatever procedural conclusion remained. He waited until Eleanor had arranged her hands in her lap with the composed satisfaction of a woman who has just received confirmation that a long campaign has ended in her favor. Then he stood. He did not make a production of standing. He simply rose from his chair at the respondent's table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has now arrived at it. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a rectangular object roughly the size of a large textbook covered in blue leather, and he walked to the evidence table beside the clerk's desk and set it down with a sound that was quieter than it should have been given the weight of what it contained. "Your Honor," he said, "the respondent requests permission to submit one additional document package for the court's consideration prior to entry of the final order." Judge Whittaker looked at the blue binder on the evidence table. She looked at Michael. Her expression did not change, but something in the quality of her attention shifted in a way I had been hoping to see since September. "Proceed," she said. Benton looked at the blue binder. He had not seen it before. I watched the recognition of this fact move through his face, the slight tightening around the eyes, the controlled recalibration of a man who has been surprised by something he does not yet understand. He was good enough not to react visibly, but he was not good enough to entirely conceal the moment of recalibration. Eleanor turned her head toward the evidence table. 3 degrees. The same controlled, careful movement she had made when Michael said no objection. Her eyes found the blue binder and stayed there. The clerk carried the binder to Judge Whittaker. The judge opened it and began to read. The courtroom went very quiet. Not the performative quiet that settles over a room during testimony, but the different, denser quiet of people who sense that something is about to change and are holding themselves still as though any movement might cause them to miss the moment it happens. Thomas, against the wall to my left, was not breathing in any way I could detect. Donna Chen, 3 seats from Thomas, had her hands pressed flat against her knees. Carl Whitmore was looking at the floor with his jaw tight, the way he looked when a pour was running, and he was waiting for the concrete to tell him whether it was going to behave. Benton watched Judge Whittaker read. His portfolio was closed on the table in front of him. He had stopped pretending to review notes. David shifted in his seat. Just once. A small lateral movement, the adjustment of a man who has become slightly less comfortable in the past 2 minutes than he was before and cannot identify why. It was the beginning of understanding. Judge Whittaker turned a page, then another. She removed her reading glasses and held them in her right hand and looked at one page without them, the way you look at something when you want to see it differently and the glasses are getting in the way. She turned to the final section, read for another 40 seconds, set her glasses on the bench in front of her. She looked at Charles Benton. "Counselor," she said, and the word landed in the courtroom with the particular weight of a word spoken by someone who has read something carefully and arrived at a question that requires a very precise answer. "Before this court enters a final order, I need clarification on one matter." Benton straightened. "Of course, Your Honor." She looked at him for a moment before speaking. The look of a person who already knows the answer to the question she is about to ask, and is asking it anyway, because the record requires it. "Did you independently verify," she said, "whether every asset listed in this petition actually belongs to Mr. Miller's personal estate?" Charles Benton answered without hesitating. "Yes, Your Honor. We verified ownership through the county property records and the corporate registration on file with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. Judge Whitaker looked at him the way a structural engineer looks at a drawing that has passed its initial review but contains something that wants a second look. Then she turned a page in the blue binder. "Were you aware," she said, "that Miller Architecture Incorporated was transferred into an entity called the Miller Legacy Trust in August of this year, with that transfer recorded with the Fairfax County Circuit Court Clerk's office on the 14th of that month?" The question arrived in the courtroom with the quiet, specific force of a load applied to a point that was not designed to receive it. Benton opened his top folder. He went to the corporate registration section. He read it. He turned to the property records section. He read that. He looked up at Judge Whitaker with the expression of a mock standing in a building he has just realized is configured differently than the plans he was given. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "our research indicated that the assets were held in Mr. Miller's name." "Your research," Judge Whitaker said, "relied on records from 2 years prior to the current filing." She held up a single page from the binder. "This is the recorded trust instrument filed with this court in August. It has been a matter of public record for nearly 3 months." She set the page down. "Did your office pull current title before preparing this petition?" The courtroom went the specific kind of quiet that happens when 30 people simultaneously understand something and are each waiting to see whether anyone else will say it first. Benton's jaw moved slightly. "We relied on the information provided by our client," he said. Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a word. The sound a person makes when the floor they were certain was solid shifts beneath them, and they have not yet fallen, but understand they are going to. She turned to Benton, and her composure, extraordinary all morning, developed its first visible fracture. "What does she mean?" Her voice was still controlled, but the control was costing her now. "What is she talking about?" Benton put his hand on her forearm. "Give me a moment," he said. He did not have a moment. Judge Whitaker was already turning another page. "The Miller Legacy Trust," she said, reading from the document, "is an irrevocable trust established under Virginia Code Section 64.2, executed by Arthur Daniel Miller as grantor in August of this year." She read from the asset list. 100% of the issued shares of Miller Architecture Incorporated. The real property at 1422 Willow Creek Drive, Fairfax, Virginia. All associated financial accounts, intellectual property holdings, and equipment inventory. She set the page down and looked at Eleanor directly. "None of these assets are part of Mr. Miller's personal estate. They were legally transferred out of his personal ownership before this petition was filed. This court has no jurisdiction over them in a conservatorship proceeding." David stood up. His chair scraped hard against the floor, and the sound cut through the quiet like something breaking open. "That's not possible." His voice came out higher than he intended. "Everything is in his name. I've seen the documents. I've seen the registrations. Mr. Marsh." Judge Whitaker's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It carried the particular authority of someone who has been saying difficult things in difficult rooms for a very long time and has learned that volume is unnecessary when clarity is sufficient. "You will sit down." David sat. His face had gone the color of concrete in cold weather, pale and slightly gray, and the knee that had been still since Eleanor signed her name had started moving again beneath the table. Judge Whitaker turned to the final page of the trust section. "The trust further specifies that Mr. Miller's personal estate, meaning assets not transferred into the trust, consists of the following." She read. "A personal checking account containing $10,000. One 2011 Ford F-150 pickup truck with approximately 114,000 miles." She set the page down. The conservatorship agreement signed by Mrs. Eleanor Miller and Mr. David Marsh this morning has legal effect over those assets, and those assets only. She looked at Eleanor. You have accepted fiduciary responsibility for $10,000 and a used vehicle. Eleanor's right hand pressed flat against the table surface. Her fingers spread. She stared at Judge Whittaker with an expression that had passed through several stages in the past 60 seconds and arrived somewhere I had not expected to see on her face. Not anger, not calculation. Something rawer than either. The expression of a person who has understood with complete and sudden clarity exactly how thoroughly they have been outmaneuvered. There has to be something. Her voice was barely above a whisper. There has to be. Benton put his hand on her arm. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help, and his silence carried the particular quality of a man performing the last professional service available to him, which was to stop making things worse. Michael had not sat down since rising to submit the blue binder. He looked at me once briefly with an expression that was not triumph and not relief, but something between them without a clean name, the expression of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. I gave him one small nod. From the gallery, I heard Thomas exhale, the sound of a man who has been holding his breath for 4 months and has just been given permission to stop. Judge Whittaker gathered the pages into a neat stack at the edge of the bench. She looked at the courtroom with the composed thoroughness of a person completing an inventory. Before this court rules on the conservatorship petition, she said, I have one additional matter to address. She looked at the blue binder on the clerk's desk. Mr. Ross, there appear to be additional materials in this submission beyond the trust documents. Michael said, Yes, Your Honor, there are. Are those materials relevant to the current proceeding? They are relevant to matters that may require the court's attention beyond the scope of the conservatorship petition, he said carefully. They document certain actions taken by the petitioners over the preceding months that this court may wish to refer to the appropriate authorities. Judge Whittaker held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she said, Place them before the court. And Michael reached into the blue binder and began to take out the evidence one piece at a time and lay it on the clerk's desk, and the courtroom watched in absolute silence as the architecture of what Arthur Miller had built over 5 months became visible to everyone in the room at once. Judge Whittaker reviewed each piece of evidence without speaking. The toxicology report. Carol Nguyen's written summary and the image from her waiting room camera. Sandra's 11 photocopied documents with their handwritten index. The home camera footage described in the lab technician's certification attached to the drive. The cashier's check from Eleanor still sealed in its original envelope, $150,000 addressed to Michael Ross. When she finished, she removed her glasses and set them on the bench. She looked at me. I straightened my spine. For the first time since 9 o'clock that morning, I sat the way I actually sit, fully upright, shoulders back, the posture of a man who has spent 40 years presenting work he believed in to rooms full of people who needed to understand it. I adjusted my jacket. I put both hands flat on the table. David made a sound that was not quite a word. Eleanor went completely still. I looked at them both. A good architect, I said, designs for the load he knows is coming. I saw what you were building inside my house months before you finished it. Everything in that binder is what I built in response. I paused. The last blueprint was always for Leo. Judge Whittaker spoke before either of them could answer. I am referring the criminal evidence in this submission to the Fairfax County Commonwealth's attorney for review. She looked at the court officers flanking the room. Officers, please detain the respondents to this referral pending formal contact from the prosecutor's office. David pushed back his chair. This is not legal. You cannot do this. The court officers were already moving. Then from somewhere behind me, I heard Thomas's voice. Low, steady, the voice he used on a job site when something had gone exactly right, after a long time going wrong. "There he is," Thomas said. "There's the colonel." From the gallery, someone began to clap. Then someone else. Then all of them standing the sound-filling courtroom 3. The way light fills a room when you finally open the window you forgot was there. I did not turn around. I looked toward the back row where Judge Rebecca Lane had been sitting all morning. Her seat was empty. She was already gone, moving quietly through the side corridor with the case file under her arm, and I would later learn her phone already raised to make a call. Outside courtroom 3. The November air came through the courthouse doors, cold and clean. I stood on the top step and breathed it in before anyone reached me. Thomas got there first. He gripped my hand with both of his and held on longer than usual and said nothing, which was exactly right. Sandra stood at the bottom of the steps with her coat buttoned to the collar and her eyes bright in the way of someone who has been holding something in for a long time and has finally been permitted to let it go. I walked down and took her hand and said thank you in a way the words were not large enough to carry. Carol found me near the parking garage. "Your tea results," she said. "All clear." I told her I had thrown it out 3 months ago. She smiled, the kind of smile that carries more than it shows. Judge Lane stopped briefly on her way to her car. "You built something solid," she said. I told her I had learned from good materials. She nodded once and walked on. I drove home alone. The house on Willow Creek Drive was quiet, in a way it had not been for 18 months. A clean quiet. The kind that belongs to a structure that is finally holding the weight it was designed to hold. 14 years later, Leo handed me back the drawing. The little house. 4 walls, a roof, a door. "I kept it," he said. My throat tightened. Outside the glass wall of the building I designed 40 years ago, the Virginia sky was going blue above the tree line. The greatest blueprint, I thought, was never the building. It was always the people still standing when the work was done. Trust is a structure. Like any structure, it reveals its weaknesses under load. The people who stayed: Thomas, Sandra, Carol, Michael. Leo, they were the load-bearing walls. The ones who tried to take everything were just pressure. I also learned something I should have understood sooner. Do not wait until someone is already inside your house before you decide what you are willing to protect. I was fortunate. Not everyone is. If this grandpa story taught you anything, let it be this: build your protections before you need them, not after. Looking back, I made one significant mistake. I trusted too quickly and verified too slowly. Do not be like me in that regard. The people who love you will not be offended by your caution. The ones who are offended by it are telling you something important. I believe God put certain people in our path at exactly the right moment. Leo walking into my study that Sunday evening. Thomas picking up the phone on the first ring. Carol Nguyen reading a file carefully enough to know something was wrong. None of that felt like coincidence. This has been one man's family story, and I hope it reminded you that the most valuable things we build are not made of steel or concrete. If this grandpa story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if family stories like this one matter to you, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. One final note. Some stories on this channel contain fictional elements constructed for storytelling and educational purposes. If that is not the content you are looking for, we completely respect that. Please feel free to find something that serves you better. We will be here for the ones who stay.